And I was crying and she asked me, what's wrong? And I said, I'm Black. And she was like, what? Hello, my name is Tatu Gatere and I am the founder and CEO of Build Her. Welcome to the Power Panel Podcast Echoes.
I am actually really intrigued about who you are.
My parents were what I call my first feminists. My mom was always pushing me to be my best.
You say that you had this visceral pull to come back to the continent.
I want architecture to contribute to social change. 60% of Nairobians live in informal settlements, and the life they lead is very different to the 40s.
So you then found yourself as a country director by choice, working in, I suppose, one of Africa's largest urban settlements, Kibera.
But even when you work with disadvantaged groups, you feel like an imposter. What are you doing here? What do you know about this place? My accountability is not just to what's in front of me. It's about the future. I'm driven by people's power.
Welcome to the Power Panel Podcast Echoes, a segment of our show dedicated to exciting intergenerational conversations with some of Africa's young, dynamic women leaders. I am your host, Ambassador Rachel Omamo, a senior counsel, diplomat, and former cabinet minister in Kenya. Thank you so much for joining us on the Power Panel Podcast, Tatu. It's really a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. I am actually really intrigued about who you are. I've read about you, but I really want to have this conversation with you because you're an architect who has become a social entrepreneur and you've set up this amazing award-winning NGO that is targeted at women in the construction industry. And, you know, that sort of thing doesn't happen every day. So even as we begin and even as we welcome you, the first thing I want to know is what is Build Her? Just what is it? So that our audience can understand how innovative you are. So Karibu.
Thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to be invited here. When you reached out, I felt very honored that you considered my story worth highlighting. Build Her is a social enterprise that works with women from informal settlements, women from vulnerable communities, vulnerable backgrounds. And we connect them and give them the opportunity to access high quality construction training. And we focus on construction finishes. So it's tiling, painting, carpentry, joinery, cabinetry, solar. And we do this so that they can access a very high growth, in demand sector where they can basically make money and improve their lives, improve the lives of their families, have agency, power, and contribute to the social, and physical structures of our cities and communities.
I mean, that is just such an out-of-the-box idea. I mean, it is something that we obviously need in Kenya and in Africa, but it's also an industry where women's presence at that level, the level of the tradesperson, is not always appreciated and has not been occupied fully. So good on you for seeing that gap and for walking directly into it and beginning to build. Now, I love that you've called your NGO Build Her, because from reading about you, I sort of came to the conclusion that as you were building your career, as you were building people, you're also building yourself. And that your life has been a series of building blocks, I think. And I'd like to unpack that and to learn the lessons from your experiences and how you've been able to shape yourself to be this extraordinary woman working in this extraordinary NGO that you've set up and making such an impact on our continent. And often our building blocks, our foundation, is our families. So tell me a little bit about your family and what are the key lessons, the key values that you extracted from your family that you have kept with you and that have helped you navigate your leadership path to where you are today.
I guess I would start with my parents. My father is a mechanical engineer, a very smart man, very intimidatingly smart, I would say sometimes. Very sharp minded, very sharp wit. And I think my dad is one of those characters who had so much passion in everything he does. He had passion for his family, he had passion for his work, and he had passion for the things that keep him happy and kept him fulfilled. And my mother, to me, is more of a grounding persona in my life. She is the type of woman who was also really smart, and sometimes I think she even hid the level of intelligence that she held. And she was very grounded, and a woman who gave up almost everything just to take care of her family. And I say just because I feel like she could have done a lot more when I look at her intelligence and what she ended up doing with her life. My parents were what I call my first feminists. And when I say that, people always, and even they would be shocked when they hear me say that. But they were the type of parents that never limited who you could be. My dad never said to me, you can or can't do this. My mom was always pushing me to be my best. Everything I did, she would always ask, Tatu, is that your best? And if it wasn't my best, she'd say, that's all I want from you, is to just always do your best. And my dad, apart from watching him at work, because something that I think came out of me of how he approached his work wasn't just how you earned money. It was a calling. It was passion. It was a privilege to do what you did. And I actually, would go to work with him and watch him, and I was just so fascinated by that. But apart from that, I would also watch him build his hobbies. He's an avid golfer. Even in his 70s, he can still have a hole-in-one day. And,
Wow.
and I saw him play golf through everything, through the difficulties we faced as a family, through the ups and downs of his business. And even in his later years, when he had a terminal disease, he still played golf and it kept him alive. And he beat the disease, I think, through joy. And for my mother, I watched her give up everything for her family and then slowly find herself again. And she found herself through the church. She did a lot of volunteer work with the church. She also worked for the church. And I saw her go across Kenya doing a variety of crazy community projects. She was always in Mtito Ande, in Moranga, in Nyeri, working with communities, teaching them how to farm or to keep chicken for income or just, different things just to help them sustain their livelihoods. And it was always really remote places where there was barely water, barely infrastructure. And she'd come home and she'd have these stories. And to be able to see her find her passion and purpose later in life, because when we're growing up, you just think it's mom. But I think that really led me to want that for myself.
Was the fact that you were an all-girls family pivotal to your leadership in any way? Did it just make girls girls empowerment just obvious, just natural, just commonplace?
Okay, I like that question because yes, it absolutely framed my leadership because my parents are strong characters and my sisters are also really strong characters. And growing up, we were such strong personalities. I think we bumped heads a lot, but we were also very independent characters. We were raised to express ourselves. We didn't hold back. If something didn't work or we wanted to say something, my parents wanted to hear from it. And I think what surprised me is when I went out into the world and women and girls were not like that. I think I was just always shocked when you ask a woman what she thinks. If she doesn't say it, I'm like, what's going on? Because my sisters were very vocal, very strong from a very young age. And I think one of the things I looked for is I always understood that women held that strength. So whether or not you express it, whether or not you're reserved, there's no part of me that believes women are as demure as the society would like us to believe. And so I think I always had this understanding that women are just as capable. And there's also this rhetoric that women can be competitive. I don't think I ever believed that because even in our competition, we supported each other.
Okay, all right. Now, at some point, you decided or you ended up going to university in America. And you've often described it as a very traumatic period in your time, in your life, sort of um, a period that opened up your sense of self to you in ways that you didn't imagine. So tell me about that experience and also how your choice of architecture as a career was intertwined in that experience.
Yeah, so actually, initially, I had an opportunity to either go to the UK or the US. And I chose the US because my father was there. He had moved there before me by about 2 years. And growing up, my father was always a very expressive person and showed love. But I think I was reserved growing up. So I wanted to reconnect with him. And that's why I chose America. And when I got there, life was initially hard because he didn't go there from a strong financial position. So basically, a man who had his own company in Kenya was the boss, everybody doing everything for him. He moved to a whole new country in his late 40s and started from scratch. And so you can imagine watching your dad, who drove the big car, was respected, played golf in Muthaiga, in the golf clubs where the who's and who's are hanging out. And here he is starting from scratch. And I think that experience of seeing your parent, this iconic figure for you, be so humbled was the first traumatic thing for me. And then I think the second was I had to make my own way because he didn't have that capacity to make the way for me. And so I quickly got a job and I had to work and go to school. So I would work during the day and then in the evening I would attend night school. And I did that for about 3 years. And then um, I applied to a school in Arkansas. And I did that because I'm so thankful that I had the wisdom to understand that the city I was living in, which was Washington, D.C., was just too expensive and it was causing me more difficulty. So I looked for a small college town where life was affordable. And um, and through that process was able to stabilize my life, but I still had to go to school and work and make my way, figure out my finances, apply for financial aid. I mean, it was just a very hectic, tiring period. I was an adult, I think, faster than many Kenyans I had grown up with had to be. And
But why
mhm,
did you keep going? I mean, you could have come
yes,
back to Kenya and gone to Nairobi University or to JQAT and done your architecture
yes,
in less stressful and traumatic circumstances.
yes. So the thing about that was in Kenya, I didn't have any financial support to go to school. So that's why I had gone abroad to go to school. So that was the first one. And the second was the magazines I had seen about architecture when I was in high school. All of that architecture was happening outside the country. We barely had skyscrapers at that point. And it's funny, after architecture, skyscrapers is something I've never wanted to design, but it's what took me there. And I think when I entered the world of architecture, I was a bit enamored. I just had never understood what design was, how it could shape our environments, how it could inspire us, how it influenced people. And I was really driven by this idea that I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know how to do what I saw in the magazines, and I wanted to know how to do it. And so, even when I moved from the University of Washington, D.C., which is where I went to school first, and I went to the University of Arkansas next, that shift was because DC had a lot of it was a very technical approach, more the science approach to architecture. And I went to Arkansas looking for the design. I loved the technical, but I wanted to do what I saw in the magazines. And I think that drove my ambition.
Mm. Architecture is a very interesting discipline in the sense that, you have to be two things. You have to be logical and you also have to be creative. And given your experiences in your childhood, this experience of having to really transform yourself into this independent, dynamic young lady, this dialectic between logic and creativity, how did it operate as a fuel for you?
I mean, that is such a beautiful thing that you've asked, because growing up, I was never really strong in school. I didn't get it. I used to go home and ask my mom, tell me where I'm going to use this. I just didn't understand education in Kenya. And the funny thing is, when I discovered architecture, I was always a creative. I had a business selling jewelry really young. Um, so I was a person who was always interested in business and the arts. I did art in high school. But when I joined the architecture program, the funny thing is, it's like my logic and my creative side integrated for the first time. I had never had that before. And that excited me in a way that, from coming from someone who was never strong in school, I was one of the strongest people. From the first day of uni, I was one of the strongest
Oh,
students,
wow.
because it just all of a sudden made sense. And then also I realized how education really influences us, because in architecture school, a lot of the kids are the smartest kids in the class, but they're also the kids who are the DJs, the kids who had bands, the kids who, there was so much creativity and science from other programs from other countries. So I started to see that our culture in Kenya sometimes separates culture from logic, science from art, and it's not true. I think most of the world's greatest scientists were creatives. And for sure, most of the greatest leaders are creatives as well. So I think discovering that combination is what shifted my trajectory.
As we take this short power break, we ask that you subscribe to the Power Panel podcast. Let's work together to expand the Power Panel community. Visit our website, birdsongafrica.com, and follow us on social media to plug into the Power Panel network. Email your thoughts to hello@birdsongafrica.com. This is the Power Panel podcast. Echoes. Okay, so you began to really connect with yourself, I think, in terms of your career choice, in terms of just, opening up your mind. But yet you say that you had this visceral pull to come back to the continent, to kind of engage with your culture, to reconnect with I guess your roots, your place of origin. And you did come back to the continent, and you say that your first stop was in South Africa, and then you came back to Kenya. And you went into the private sector. What was the attraction?
Yes. So actually, I'll take your question a bit back, because
Okay.
what I experienced in America, which was also traumatic, but also was my breakthrough in terms of my life and what I've done with my life, was discovering that I was Black. So I remember I was in a train in
Oh,
Washington.
okay.
I was on a train in Washington, D.C., and I didn't even have enough credit, but I used what I had to call my sister in Kenya. And I was crying, and she asked me, "What's wrong?" And I said, "I'm Black." And she was like, "What?" And I was like, "I'm Black." And she laughed, and she's like, "I guess so, silly. Why does that matter?" And I was like, I can't explain it, but it was so heartbreaking, because in America, especially at that time before all the social justice movements, Black was associated with less than. And in Kenya, you were African, which was great. Nobody ever made you feel less than. So that sparked inquiry for me about what Blackness was. And then I started discovering, different authors and different artists and how they would define themselves as Black American. And so I started to build the power in the definition for myself. But I also started to notice exclusion, economic exclusion, social exclusion. And as I moved from the East Coast, I went to Washington, D.C., then Arkansas in the South. And then I worked on the West Coast in Seattle, where there were very few Black people in the city. And I worked for a firm where I was, I think, the only Black employee. Again, I would notice how difficult it is when you're the other and you have to navigate the systems and opportunities held by the majority. So that sort of framed my interest in understanding inequality globally. And from Seattle, I got the opportunity to go work for a well-known architect in South Africa. And we did amazing community-centered work. And his way of approaching design, architecture, and form is so beautiful. And it was the first time I really got to work hand in hand on celebrating the disadvantaged, the marginalized. He was doing beautiful buildings to reflect culture. So that stayed with me. And then when I came to Kenya, I worked for a very high-profile commercial architecture firm. And in that firm, our clients were not really interested in regionalism, which is how architecture can bring communities and social aspects together. And so I was fighting to bring that grounding into the work we were doing. And through that process, I think I discovered that that's actually what I want to do. The company might not be able to do it, but I want architecture to contribute to social change.
You left America that had its own forms of exclusion. Then you moved to South Africa that has been dealing with exclusion to try and open up and democratize their society after years of apartheid. How did those contrasting environments shape your understanding about this whole idea of inclusive architecture, this architecture that integrates people, this architecture that brings community together?
Yes. And
You know, I'm beginning to feel as if I'm psychoanalyzing you, and I must
yeah,
stop.
yeah, no, it's fine.
Go on.
It's actually, but you're also making me think of this quote by Trevor Noah. You know, he says that he feels like America has lukewarm racism. He's like, if you want the real brand of racism, go to South Africa.
Mm.
And really, that's what it was for me when I arrived in South Africa. It was, I thought I had understood racism and exclusion and inequality, and then I arrived and I was like, oh boy, it was just a different flavor. But to see that exist and to see different groups, multiracial people within groups working to create a place of equality, that was very interesting. And then to come to Kenya and to see that, yes, there is some racial dynamics in Kenya, but our inequality is economic. We have totally excluded people who don't have access to schools, to jobs, to education opportunities, and they live very different lives from the other part of the city. So 60% of Nairobians live in informal settlements, and the life they lead is very different to the 40s. So I always say that journey of facing inequality and racism opened up my eyes, not just to global conditions, but to my bias, to my privilege, to how there was places for me to also consider how I was working with disadvantaged groups in my daily life.
So you then found yourself as a country director by choice, working in, I suppose, one of Africa's largest urban settlements, Kibera, and engaging now really directly with scores of the urban poor. Um, I want you to describe to me what that transition felt like. That transition of moving away from the private sector to the nonprofit world, but also having a different type of client.
Yes. I think, yeah,
And how do you gain understandings of what your
yes,
clients want, what they need, um, but without disrespecting their humanity, merely because they don't have resources.
Yes. And not just their humanity, their expertise as well, because they are the experts of their environment. So I think I would describe that transition as painful. I don't know how else to describe it, but especially in the initial months. Because when I first moved from doing high profile projects with, the who's and who's and the upper echelons of Nairobi, to go work in Kibera and those are your clients, and to realize you know nothing about them. You know nothing about the way they grow up. You know nothing about what they face every day. It was really humbling to be able to ground myself in that and to stop feeling like an imposter. So we always talk about from you to the higher levels of society. But even when you work with disadvantaged groups, you feel like an imposter. What are you doing here? What do you know about this place? And so navigating that initially was very painful. But then, I had this amazing team who really took me under their wing, team members who had grown up in Kibera. This was their home, who would, take you for lunch in their favorite spots and explain to you things that they see you couldn't understand. And for me, I think that changed my perception from imposter to collaborator. I'm not from here. I don't know about here, but I can learn. And through that learning, I can help articulate the expertise that I bring to the table into the rooms, into the spaces where I can advocate for these groups. But also, I can help these groups shape what they understand from an intuitive, experiential, approach or experience, um, to help them translate what it is they know into structures, into systems, into processes, into formalization of groups. And so it became fun. I think after the first year, I really started to have fun. I really started to enjoy the projects we were doing. I mean, Kibera has so many children, and the kids are just always engaged and open. And I would enjoy being in spaces, learning from the kids. The elderly communities are always willing to explain to you the history of Kibera and where their community came from. And so I found that these perceptions and these experiences made me a better, more thoughtful designer. They made me a more courageous and humble leader. Um, yeah, and I just learned so much, and my leadership really began to form from that. I would just add that my perception about life and about leadership and design is that the more complexity and the more diverse groups you have in the conversation, it's going to be better.
Now, you said something about this experience of yours in Kibera, and you said that one of the challenges is that it creates a different type of accountability, which I suppose also means there's a different ethos, there's a different ethic. I'm wondering, when you come to that realization, how do you reshape your leadership? When you say your accountability is different,
Yeah.
I mean, you're contrasting it with something, the accountability perhaps that you had in the private sector and the accountability that you have working in the informal settlement. What is that accountability?
I think I would describe it as the bottom line or the impact and the result. They just take a different dimension. In architecture, it was about the budgets, the costs, the client satisfaction. In Kibera, it's about sustainability. Who runs this thing after you leave? Who supports this thing through all the political upheaval? Who defends it? Who defines it? Who you know um, grows it over time? And the accountability was not just to, and even now with Build Her, my accountability is not just to what's in front of me. It's about the future. Who in the future will rely on this program? Who in the future will depend on this program, on this organization? And are you already creating space for them today? And then additionally, I think the social structure in architecture is very different. The client in front of you and the users of the building matter. But in Kibera, all age groups, all educations, every user who could ever come by this thing matters. And you have to consider them. Just a deeper level of accountability.
I want to play a clip from an interview that I did last year with an extraordinary social justice activist called Aketa Kandriana Rafitason. I want you to listen to it and then I'll ask you a question.
As I said, I'm very passionate about people power, and you can't get people power without the people. So it's about the spirit of togetherness. It's about building something together. That's how it is. That's how I see it.
Okay. Well, just to summarize what Kay is saying, she's basically saying that her work is about people and power. It's about unlocking people's power, working together and creating communities. Yeah. Now, in a place like Kibera, where you say building communities, whether it's communities of practice, communities of love, communities of empowerment, whatever you want to call it, if that is the modus operandi of your work, I want to know whether you felt intimidated by people's power or whether you saw people's power as your driving force and how you harnessed it.
I think it started in Kibera and it still continues in Build Her today. I'm driven by people's power. I'm driven by the fact that everybody knows what they need and everybody can contribute to developing it if they're supported with the resources to do so. So expertise is held first and foremost by the people who experience a context or a thing. And that absolutely drives my work because even now with Build Her, the organization is shaped by the experiences and perceptions of the women alumni. We go back to them and we say, how did it work out? How did the training prepare you and what's missing? And they share so much that has helped us innovate and iterate. And without that feedback, we wouldn't be where we are.
So tell me of a project of which you are very proud that you were able to start from the expertise and wisdom of the people to create something transformational that exists today in Kibera. What was it that when you look at it, you say, yeah, I got that right? That's people's power.
Yes.
That's community engagement. That's aligning people's expertise, irrespective of whether it's academic expertise, but just know-how.
I would say my first skills training program was in Kibera. I launched a youth training program for carpentry and joinery. And we trained about 30 youth with that program. And I really strived to get 50% of the participants as women and failed. I only got 2. And from the 28, 27 men that I trained, a lot of the training program was developed by them. So we were very clear on the technical aspect that we wanted to train on. But we gave a stipend, we had a partnership with a very established carpentry joinery program. But in the initial weeks of the program, the men were struggling. And even the women were really struggling to come to the training and to succeed in the training. And so I was so desperate because I had tried so many things. And I just said, hey, can we just sit down, guys, and have a chat? And when we sat down, I was so focused on this awesome opportunity we were providing them. But they were focused on the parts I didn't see. So why weren't they succeeding? They were worried about the friends they'd left behind. They were worried that when they got back home, there'd be no food. They were worried about one of their friends who was in substance abuse, something happening to them. And I had never considered that training alone was not enough to support a disadvantaged or vulnerable group from succeeding. You had to think about their psychology. You had to think about their emotions. You had to think about the self-leadership that they had to navigate change. Change is not easy for anyone, especially when you come from disadvantaged groups. And so I basically sat with them and said, map out for me what you would like for me to support, to help you to stay here and focus here. I can't change what's happening at home, but I can help you focus here. And they drafted, like I was just writing, but they drafted that they wanted to understand how to not be discouraged by succeeding and leaving others you grew up with behind. They didn't know how to deal with communication. They didn't know how to deal with mental health, stabilizing their mental health when their parents or their sisters were sick. They didn't know how to share their progress with their communities. And so we sat and we drafted everything else they thought was missing. And we created a program all over again, where technical training was 75% of what we did and 25% was everything else. And why I say that was really impactful is because that is the thinking that also brought me into Build Her. And then separately for the women who, I only got 2 women out of 30, but I spoke to over 50 women to try to get them to join the program. And they tell me they were coming, but they never did. But when I reached out to them to have chai or to take them for lunch, let's go buy you a chapati and let's talk. They expressed to me all the things I hadn't considered when I was asking women to join a construction training program. And so through that learning, again, is how I established the approach of Build Her. And if I had known what I know now, that program would have attracted more women. But basically, the community taught me what I needed to know.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of Tatu Gatere's inspiring leadership story. Join us next week for the concluding part of her journey. Meanwhile, subscribe, like, and share this episode with someone who believes in the power of bold ideas. This is the Power Panel Podcast Echoes.